The original story of vampires can be traced back to various ancient myths and legends that predate the modern conception of vampires in popular culture. While the image of a vampire as we know it today, immortal creatures with fangs who drink blood, has its roots in literature and folklore, the broader concept of undead creatures that feed on life force or blood has existed in many different cultures for thousands of years. Mesopotamian and Greek mythology. Some of the earliest vampire-like creatures come from ancient civilizations. In Mesopotamian mythology, there were figures like the Lamashtu, a demoness who preyed on babies and pregnant women. In Greek mythology, there were creatures called Empusa and Lamia, which were female monsters that would suck the blood of young men and drink their life force. They were often associated with seduction, death, and the supernatural. Slavic folklore. The modern vampire myth is often credited to Slavic and Eastern European folklore. In these traditions, vampires were generally considered to be the spirits of the dead that returned to suck the blood of the living. Slavic vampires, known as Yupper or Strigoi, were seen as revenants. People would die but return to life in a monstrous form, often seeking to feed on the blood of the living. These creatures were typically linked to death, disease, and graveyards, and people believed that if someone was a vampire, they could be identified by their bloated appearance and dark, bloodshot eyes. Romania and the legend of Dracula. The most famous vampire figure in Western literature is Count Dracula, created by Bram Stoker in his 1897 novel Dracula. Stoker's Dracula is inspired by historical figures like Vlad the Impaler, a 15th century ruler of Wallachia who was notorious for his cruelty. The character Dracula, however, was a fictionalized version of a vampire, and the novel drew heavily on earlier folklore. Stoker combined elements of the vampire myths with the idea of an aristocratic, charming figure who could seduce and manipulate others. Evolution of the vampire myth. The vampire myth underwent significant transformation as it passed through different cultures and literary traditions. 16th to 18th century Europe. During this period, fear of the dead rising from their graves, especially in places like Serbia, Hungary, and Bulgaria, was common. People believed that certain individuals who were evil in life could become vampires after death. The dead were often exhumed and found to be unusually well-preserved or bloated, which led people to believe that the body was still alive and feeding on the living. This was the era when vampire hunts, staking to the heart, and decapitation became part of the folklore. 19th century Gothic literature. In the 19th century, vampire stories began to evolve into something more sophisticated and romanticized. The publication of Dracula in 1897 solidified the vampire as a literary figure, blending horror with themes of sexuality, immortality, and corruption. This book laid the foundation for many modern interpretations of the vampire as a complex, tragic figure rather than just a mindless monster. Vampires in modern culture. Since Stoker's Dracula, vampires have appeared in countless books, films, and television shows, where their characteristics have been further developed and altered. Some key shifts include the romanticized vampire. In modern depictions, vampires often take on a tragic or even heroic role. The image of the vampire as an outsider, cursed to live forever while grappling with the consequences of their immortality, became a prominent theme. This shift began with stories like in Rice's The Vampire Chronicles and continues in various media today, e.g. Twilight, True Blood, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Vampires as metaphors. Vampires in literature and film have often served as metaphors for different aspects of human experience, from the fear of death and the unknown to the exploration of addiction, sexuality, and power dynamics. The original stories of vampires were deeply rooted in cultural beliefs surrounding death, the afterlife, and disease. Over time, these myths were shaped and transformed, particularly by literature in the 19th and 20th centuries, into the vampire archetype we recognize today. The evolution from malevolent spirits or revenants to charismatic and tragic figures reflects changing human attitudes toward death, immortality, and the human condition.